All right, says we're live. Welcome everyone. This is the Jordan B. Peterson Community Study Group. I guess we have the website jordanbpeterson.community, which has all our links to our reading group, our forums, and all that. Today we're joined with Kurt, who is a kind of new member and actually is a participant in a live in the flesh Jordan Peterson meeting. So that's pretty cool. And today we're going to be discussing the first and probably parts of the later discussions between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson recently at the Vancouver uh, uh, theater that was set forward by the Pingburn Philosophy crowd. So, welcome, Kurt.
Thank you, everyone. It's nice to be here. I'm a bit of a fan of Jordan Peterson, as I know many of you are. I'm going to go see him later today, as a matter of fact, in Baltimore. So I'm pretty excited about that and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, that's so cool. He's coming to Kansas City October 4th, so I'll be at least participating with the rest of the crowd there. So hopefully be able to get a better community or something going around here as well. Anyway, so during our conversations over the weekend, we went over a lot of the atheist followers of Jordan Peterson and their distaste for his slyness or his sliminess and how he tends to slither away from any of the questions regarding his belief or lack of a belief in any sort of actual objective deity of any type. And so we definitely have a firm understanding, or maybe not a firm understanding, but at least some sort of understanding in the belief in regards to what Peterson believes in, like what form of God he prays to, like in regards to the conversations within his own unconscious, or the higher ideal within himself that is constantly judging how he speaks and telling him how to act, like kind of the conscious within every person. That's kind of the secular definition of like what a god would be considered within like a psychological framework, right?
Yeah, I think this is right. I mean, you can reframe or redefinitionalize God to fill many different functions. You can say, for example, a person who pursues wealth as their objective has money, or the love of money as their
Mm-hmm.
god, quote unquote, as their highest objective. And as Peterson himself has pointed out, that's what God serves as a practical level, on a pragmatic level in our day-to-day lives. It's like whether we know what that is or not, and whether what we say it is in fact it or not, because we can't always be in a state of self-deception or lack of self-awareness. Our behavior manifests that there is a highest value or a hierarchy of values
Mm-hmm.
to which we give our service in terms of how we behave. And so, on a practical, pragmatic level, there are a lot of things that can serve the place of God or place of a God. But most of these things are not supernatural in nature. There's nothing that I can see about money or the love of money or similar concepts that could be thought of as supernatural. Money is a concept that we as human beings have invented, and the history of how money came to be is an interesting history for those of you who want to look that up. But it's something we have invented and distilled, created, as a way to avoid having to barter everything all the time. It's very inconvenient if I want to trade with you, if I have to have the thing that you need when you have the thing I need at that exact moment. So we create this artificial, universal thing of value that we call money, so we can have this universalized exchange. So we have a medium. Anyway, so there's a lot of things that can serve the place of a god. Okay, that's fine. But the question for me is there a supernatural entity that created the natural universe and everything that derived from it, and or has the ability to interfere or materialize his will into the natural universe in terms of creating things or answering prayers or something like that? Is there, the man in the sky type of deity that exists?
Mhm.
And many of these have been posited throughout history. We get the Greek gods and the Roman gods, and various gods of origin that have been posited, Viking gods and so forth. So, those are gods of that kind of type. This supernatural entity that has the ability to manifest its will in our natural plane. So the question for me is, does Peterson think that kind of God exists? And he has, to my mind, never answered the question. He will say, when he's asked the question, do you believe in a God, that he doesn't know what people mean by belief and doesn't know what they mean by God. I'm like, yes, you do. You're way, way, way too smart not to understand the question. You know exactly what they're asking at. It's like, yes, you can play these games of obfuscation and pretend that you don't understand, or it could mean different things to different people, but it's like, you can't really play that game over time. It's like in any one setting, yeah, could someone mean something different? Sure. But it's not any one setting. He's been asked this question in both those literal words, and it's many, 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 many variants, many times. And every time he obscures, deflects, he won't answer that sort of supernatural question. And this is my strongest point of criticism of Peterson. Because, if he simply said, I don't want to answer that, that'd be one thing. But I don't really like someone who's that smart pretending to not understand. It's like, you have to understand. It's like, I know what the question is. You know what the question is. It's like, I shouldn't have to prove it through a logical proof, Words have a common meaning. It's like the entire value of words as such is a common meaning. The only way we can talk at all is that you and I have a common meaning for words. It's like, yes, I could mean something slightly different in my wording than your understanding, which could lead to a confusion and the need for clarification. But we can rely on the fact that as common speakers in a common language, 99.9% of the time, we have a common understanding for what words mean. So we don't have to redefine everything all the time. They've been defined for us in advance. So we don't have to spend indefinitely long just defining every single term in every sentence we use.
Mm-hmm.
That would be tedious and unnecessary. So when people does that, I find it deeply annoying.
Mm-hmm. So commonly we tend to have these distinctions for our beliefs and our disbeliefs in regards to atheism and theism. But there's also the commonly used middle position, I guess, of agnosticism, which seems to be more in line with how Peterson's outlook is, or at least how his proclaimed outlook is. So if he's secretly an atheist, he holds the agnostic position when he, in regards to all supernatural aspects of it, as he's kind of commented upon in his Psychological Significance of the Bible lecture series. He leaves the door open for the possibility, and I think that's where most of Sam Harris's fans have the distaste for him, because as Harris has pointed out in, I think, the fourth discussion in Dublin, he took an audience poll to see how many people actually had the full-on Sky Daddy idea of theism that were still Peterson fans. And so it seems strange, though, to me, that there are many other people that have proclaimed themselves as agnostics, like Robert Wright, or at least Robert Wright has identified himself as a new agnostic. So kind of leaving the question of belief or disbelief off the table. So I'm wondering, why is it that his agnosticism is a contention among his atheist followers?
Well, I think it's at least partly that we're not sure whether or not he is agnostic. I think you could derive the view that he is agnostic, or even derive the view that he is atheist, which I would tend to think is the correct answer. But the fact is, he won't answer the question so we can contend with it. It could be that, he says he doesn't go to church, which doesn't really tell you very much. And, I was a fan of Sam Harris long before I was a fan of Jordan Peterson. Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and all those guys go way, way back, long before Peterson came on the scene. I can't speak for all Sam Harris fans out there, which I would consider myself amongst them. But at least from my point of view, I wouldn't be irritated that you hold open the possibility for it. I would be irritated that you're unwilling to sort of quantify the degree to which you think it's a likely proposition. It's like, if I want to go to Peterson, it's like, well, what do you mean by belief? It's like, okay, for the purposes of this exercise, we'll define belief as, do you think it's more likely than not? It's like, is it a 50.1% proposition? So if it's more likely than not, we'll say you believe. And if it's less likely than not, we'll say that you don't believe. And I guess if you're evenly tied, you're evenly tied, and so be it. But it's like, I don't think Sam Harris would say that he thinks it's a 0% chance. I think he would say it's under 1%, but I don't think he or Richard Dawkins or even Christopher Hitchens would say 0. It's just like, we don't have any good evidence for it, and we think it's so unlikely to be below any threshold of reasonable calculation. But I think all of them would be open to the possibility, particularly Sam Harris, who's much more into meditation and what you might consider spiritual or mystical experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he'd be more open to the possibility. It's just, we don't know what starting point we're working from with Peterson. It's really, and it wouldn't be such a big deal if so much of what he talks about doesn't rely on biblical story and biblical metaphor and religious teaching as such. It's like, if the Bible is nothing more than a particularly good philosophical / rule set that's invented by man and we can learn a lot from it, that's one proposition. The proposition that Sam Harris is critical of, and I think he's been pretty clear on this point, is the degree to which it is a revealed truth from a supernatural being, and so has this position of truth that cannot be argued against. And that's where Peterson seems unwilling to define himself. Does he think that any part of the Bible is inerrant in that sense? And that's not clear. It's like, he'll say for something like the story of Cain and Abel, it's a brilliant story in 10 lines. Okay, it's a brilliant story in 10 lines. Maybe someone got really, really lucky in writing it. But is it reflecting anything more than that? I don't know. And at least what he believes.
Yeah. All right.
I suspect he doesn't. I mean, my best guess, because I won't swear to have reading or seen everything he's been in the last year, because there's a lot of it, but I've tried. So, I've listened to every podcast or every video series, the interview he's been in, to the extent that I can, and read every article I can, because I'm very interested in what he has to say. And I've seen him twice in DC, and I'm going to go see him again tonight in Baltimore. So I'm very interested in what he has to say. I've been paying attention. So the best I can determine, he doesn't believe in a supernatural deity as such. The biggest clue to that aspect was a question from an audience member in the Matt Dillahunty debate, where the audience member asked, essentially, if every human being disappeared, would God continue to exist? From a classic traditional Christian perspective, the answer is absolutely yes. Because if the universe itself ceased to exist, God would still exist, because God created the universe and is not bound by it. But Peterson's answer to the question was, well, I don't know. Well, it's like, if you believe in God in sort of the Sky Daddy sense, it's not, I don't know. The answer would be yes. So that was, I think, the biggest tell I've ever seen. But it's like, I just want you to answer the question, or at least refuse to answer it, not play these games. That would be a nice start.
We have a couple of comments in the chat. I heard him say once he felt it would take him at least a few years to know if something like the resurrection actually did happen. If he himself could totally accept that as true, I think that may be his reason for not directly saying. Also, maybe he feels the information he has to give may be disregarded to those it may help if he only adopted one specific religion, or adopted the position of atheism, which is understandable, especially from his role as a psychological or a psychologist and a clinician.
Yeah, I think that's the most. I think that's a charitable interpretation of what's going on. I'm not saying it's implausible, but it could be the case that he thinks that a significant percentage of people in general need this belief on some level to find meaning, and that he is refusing to disabuse them of the notion because they would lose that and not readily be able to replace it with something else, perhaps Peterson's own quote unquote more mature meaning of what God would mean to him, at least. So they may not be able to make that substitution. So it may be that in the interests of harm prevention, that he's not willing to define it out of that sake. If that's his motivation, okay, but it does have a slightly patronizing aspect to it in that it's a conclusion of, well, we don't need it, but these, these lower people, they need it, so we're going to do it for them. It's a little bit infantilizing.
Well, one of the books we recently read for part of our reading group was Dostoevsky's Demons, or The Possessed, which definitely deals a lot with the replacement, or it's not even replacement, it's the inevitable nihilism that leads to a certain people that had a strict belief system that held them, that kept them grounded. So like within Orthodox Russian Christianity, that was a major part of a component of their culture, to the point where the admittance of doubt to this all-encompassing narrative that kind of encapsulated their entire lives was enough to lead them into a series of confusing or detrimental ideologies that led to many atrocities committed by the peoples that took on these new ideologies.
Well, I certainly can see that. It's someone at one point had offered the proposition that religion's fundamental purpose in creation was not as a mechanism to try to explain the natural world in terms of why does the sun set and where does it go, and why does the sun sometimes disappear in the middle of the day, from what we would call an eclipse, and what are these tides and what is it. So religion wasn't really invented to do that. The fundamental reason religion was invented was to create a universal story that would unite everyone and allow everyone to operate beyond the scope of what was available before, which would presumably be the 150 person, give or take, tribal system that would predate religion as such. And not to say those people didn't have religion, but to say that what religion does is allow a harmonization framework that allows multiple tribes to cooperate and to extend the tribe with this new universal story. So maybe that was the purpose of religion. In some senses, if that was the purpose of religion, well, either way, we've sort of eclipsed it. If it's to explain the natural world, we've eclipsed it in large part with science. Mm-hmm. If it is to create a harmonization, we've eclipsed it with, more modern secular concepts that allow people to cooperate. So religion, either way, if that was the purpose, has been supplemented by more modern developments. And so, as Christopher Hitchens would have put it, it was our first, but therefore our worst, attempt to explain all these dreads, and why we still hold on to it is a bit mysterious. The only reason to hold on to it would be because it's fundamentally true, and that's the proposition we're trying to deal with.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So do you think that a secular replacement for religion in its capacity for group trust and group social bonding has arisen as of yet?
Well, in some senses, I would argue that's what a lot of the modern nation states are doing. It's precisely that. I mean, if you think about the United States in particular, its constitution doesn't provide any particular allegiance to any particular deity or god. The European states, as a general proposition, even where they have formalized religion, are even less religious than America. So even in a country like the United Kingdom, which still has a formal belief in a god, as at least in terms of the state, the population doesn't really believe that. It's been substituted for. And we have the ability to cooperate not only within these nation states but among nation states through trade agreements and other agreements. So there has been an increased harmonization that I think there are secular replacements for. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to argue that that's a substitute for all meaning. I think that a lot of problems that we're seeing in the modern world, and I'll talk about the United States in particular since I'm most familiar with it, with its Oxycontin crisis, heroin addiction crisis, it's a substitute for meaning, because in lack of meaning, people need it so bad they're going to turn to this pharmaceutical substitute, even if it's killing them. So it's not a complete substitute for meaning. Whether or not there can be secular substitutes for meanings, I would suggest yes. It can be found in just general charitable work. It can be helped finding others, principles that a lot of religions believe in, but we don't need the religious admonition to engage in those practices. So that's where I think that would be.
As I see it, Harris is continually trying to demystify, let's say, tribalism and kind of turn it into something that is either non-existent, so there's like one global tribe of all humans, or it's a tribes that aren't going to be going to war with each other just for differing beliefs in things that are unprovable, such as in religious cases.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, this is a problem, right? Whatever benefits religion is providing in terms of cooperation is also providing the very essences of the conflict too. In antiquity, and Peterson himself has pointed this out numerous times. It's like when the ancient gods, like the Greek gods or the Roman gods or the Norse gods, were competing in heaven. What it was a reflection of was their constituent populations going to war, and so their gods were figuratively going to war as well. So there's that competition. In the modern world, I think the conflicts that religion bring are a substantial fraction of the world's conflicts. When we look at what is going on, the religious views are the ones that seem to come most to my mind. It's not the only conflict, for sure. There are other conflicts, but it is a constant source of conflict. And because it gives you this deity level imprimatur, permission, seal of God to engage in it, there's no logical rebuttal to it. Whereas if we had a more pedestrian, civil, secular dispute, at least we can engage in some sort of mutual reasoning. And so religion, for whatever benefits it's providing in terms of meaning, which I won't argue are pointless, but whatever benefits it's bringing, it's also bringing a lot of dreads that I think are in some sense unique to religion. And I think those downsides are worthy of folding into the calculus.
Okay, I'll push back a bit on the ability to have mutual reasoning amongst a secular crowd, because you still have the more leftist.
Didn't you have to work today?
Yeah, I'm working later. Sorry. you have, say, the more postmodern leftist crowd that hold to transgenderism, or it's basically placing subjective facts as a higher priority to objective facts, like what we can recognize through biology, things like that. And then you have the disagreements from the more scientifically minded secular crowd that are placing objective facts in a higher position to the subjective stories that are used by others. And so there's still that disagreement that's occurring, and it's only capable of being resolved once there is some sort of higher value that is held amongst these people that they can with which they can compare things to. It's basically your level or your method of actually having a conversation with somebody is by agreeing upon some sort of higher value, and then basing all of your discoveries or your pieces of evidence in comparison to this thing.
Yeah, I think that's right, and so I don't disagree with that. But I think for those benefits you're highlighting, the detriments are also there. So it's worthy of, I think on the whole the religious wars have been a greater source of humanitarian dread than their secular ones. But
I mean, yeah, probably. I mean, just because as we become more civilized, we have different methods of having our battles. So instead of sending out hundreds and thousands from each side to kill each other, well, we have just a nuke that we can send off and to kind of end it right there, or escalate things to a much greater thing. I think that's probably, I mean, with the Cold War, that's kind of put an end to too large of wars. Like if things get too out of hand, we collectively have the capacity to annihilate everything, which is a byproduct of the more scientific endeavor. I mean, I'm not going against the scientific endeavor. I'm just pointing out that it is a much larger amount of responsibility than and capacity than is had prior to that within the battles done with swords and shields.
No, you raise a very valid point. So I'll concede your point, but I would still argue to whatever detriments that religion are bringing, it would be nice to remove those detriments, even if you want to argue that other detriments were and remain a greater threat. If we could remove some of the total amount of threat, that'd be nice. So if religion is providing whatever marginal threat, and I would suggest that it's perhaps more than marginal, but either way, it'd be nice to be rid of it. Why do we have to have it when there's no fundamental truth value behind it, if that's the case?
Well, that seems to be the difference, where within the West are or within the more scientifically minded atheist types, truth is objective, scientifically provable, falsifiable truth. It is the highest. It is our best practice of understanding the world and understanding our values, and it absolutely. The problem is when you are coming in conflict with people that do not hold that as their highest value. There is little capacity for discussion to occur. And I think primarily the reason the more religious people are fearful and distrustful of the atheistic types is because they do not have a declared highest value within morality, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
That's at least what is perceived by the more religious group.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not sure to which the degree the declared value is representative of the actual value. I mean, the recent Catholic Church issues, shall we say, coming from Pennsylvania and other places are suggestive that many people who are priests of the church don't necessarily have God as their highest value. Because if they did, it would be seemingly illogical that they would engage in the behavior they have. So it seems that their position is not affording them the morality that would be suggested from the actual belief. So their declarations are in some sense false. And in other senses, it's like the degree to which people's highest value could be said to be derived from God. I don't know there's any of those values that couldn't be derived secularly, which was Hitchens' arguments. Like what is there good that a religious person could do that a non-religious person couldn't?
Endure suffering.
Well, I don't know. That's true. I mean, suffering has potentially secular motivations. I mean, if you believe in, duty, God, duty, country, as a principle, you're going to go fight for your country. So you endure suffering because you believe in the value of the nation. I mean, that doesn't have to be religiously derived.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Insofar as you have belief in the value of your country and the respectability or the goodness or whatever of your country or your people or your family, that gives you the capacity to endure suffering for sure.
Yeah. So I guess getting back to the earlier point, it's like, is it the case that Peterson is declining to answer this question because he thinks that there are these benefits that you are alluding to? Whether or not they're true or not is a whole nother problem, but maybe in his mind, he thinks that these benefits are of substantial value, that demolishing the religious belief is not worth the existential crisis that would result.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not worth it to answer it because of the values in the false belief. It's like, maybe it's a false belief, but there's too much value there.
Well, I think this is kind of where Brett Weinstein's inclusion plays a small portion of detriment within the discussion, because Brett Weinstein kind of holds the position that religious practices can be metaphorically false, but functionally functionally true insofar as they are utilitarian or they are useful in regards to our values that we hold. So say you have the value of continuing and propagating the species and trying to bring about a better life for you and your children. By holding to these more superstitious beliefs, this provides you with a better method of doing that, at least insofar as our past history, than other beliefs that were not as practical in those regards. I kind of think of the typical skeptics of philosophy who kind of throw away everything. Like, I can't know anything at all, and so that gives me no capacity to act at all. So if you were to completely throw out all any epistemological subjective evidence basis, then you're left with nothing that you can truly know to be true. Because even like you can doubt Descartes' cogito ergo sum, where it may not be that I'm the one thinking, but something else is thinking me. There is some sort of like base facts, as the atheists use, or that we pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, and that has been effective in actually allowing us to achieve our goals. But anyway, my point was that Brett Weinstein is holding that these religions are literally false. There's no element to them that is actually correct in regards to their supernatural claims or their other claims that are being made, but they're useful. Whereas Peterson seems to be going at it at a slightly different angle. It is confusing because of his first discussion with Sam Harris on Sam Harris's podcast with pragmatism and all that. But Peterson is holding the position that while these things may not be true in the moment, if you abstract out across time, you can create this meta truth of what is occurring right here. So if let's see, in his discussion on Adam and Eve, he pointed out that after they eat from the tree of knowledge and good and evil, their eyes were open so that they could see essentially how God sees. And his understanding of that is they had the capacity to see into their past as well as make considerations about the future. And so it seems to be his position is that God is future humanity judging back upon us. And so like we're acting in accordance to what future humanity is going to think about what we've done in this present moment. And that has been true for how we live our lives. And it almost seems to me a creation of a category for the category of God as consciousness in regards to human creatures, for sure, and their capacity to judge past events and make simulations or conceptions and ideals that help us in guiding us in our acts forward. But of course, none of this is supernatural, I guess, in nature.
Yeah.
But it's still different from how Sam Harris and the new atheists tend to go about religion, by dismissing kind of the whole thing because it carries that superstitious aspect to it.
Yeah, well, in some extent, it's an issue of label, because some of the things you're talking about is, my ability to make sacrifices today for the benefit of the future. That doesn't require a religious belief. It just requires the acknowledgement of that time is a thing that exists, or at least my perception of it does. So what's the difference from my point of view? But, I work out, because it will benefit me in the future. So there are a lot of things we do with the idea of the future, and it may not benefit me necessarily. It might benefit my children or society. It may not be now. It might be 100 years from now. So, these are kinds of calculations that we make all the time on some level. In our everyday life, we make decisions about things to do now versus later, and weighing that out. So it's like, the only issue that I'm trying to resolve, it's like, do we need the supernatural element? Do we need this story to gain those benefits? It's like, I don't think so. I mean, the Scandinavian countries where belief in God seems to be essentially zero, as far as I can tell, they seem to get along pretty well, all things considered. You know, there are benefits and drawbacks to be sure, and points of critique, but you know, they seem to be able to negotiate perfectly fine. It's like, what is the lack of religion not giving them? It's like not obvious to my mind.
Well, I mean, Peterson's blow up in regards to especially young men, it seems to be hit the understanding that people have been lacking meaning in their life, and so he's been attempting to provide some sort of basis for how they can have that meaning within their lives and utilize that to achieve their goals. But of course, he's going at it from a purely psychological perspective, as opposed to the attempts made by the religious apologists in trying to prove it as some sort of existing thing that we can prove. It's like he's taking a empiricist approach to truth based upon what we can observe and have observed and what we can do with those observations. So I'm currently reading through Maps of Meaning, and it seems like the closest you could get to him having any sort of belief in a supernatural is in regards to consciousness itself. Because
I will agree with you, consciousness is certainly very mysterious and we don't understand it. Mm-hmm. But at some point you're like in the gods and the gaps argument, because it's like, well, there's a lot of things in the past that we haven't been able to understand, you know, and things which we now have explanations for. So will we ever be able to explain consciousness? I don't know, but if someday we do, well, I guess that argument disappears.
Mm-hmm. So, well, all right, let's see. Considering consciousness, it is our entire method by which we can know anything at all. If we can't explain it itself, that leaves kind of a problem in regards to our certainty in the other things that we know to be true and false. So there's kind of this distinction made by many people about objective facts and subjective facts. But in reality, all of our objective facts are composed of all of our subjective facts about what we've observed and things of that nature.
No, you make a fair point, you know, that our perceptions could in some sense be fundamentally wrong. You know, we were having this discussion yesterday about whether my green is your green. We can go one step further, whether assuming we have the same green, whether that's green at all, it would be another problem, right? Because we have no way to know that. So yeah, it could be that we lack perception in some sense. That must be true. You know, if we consider us versus, you know, every other form of animal, we obviously, there are varying degrees of perception, what you might call consciousness, and to suppose that we are the highest and finest form that could be is pretty presumptive. So, you know, it might be that we're short, you know, and so you could reasonably argue that we have doubts into our ability to draw fundamentally any conclusion. Nevertheless, it's all I have to work with. Mm-hmm. So, you know, for lack of a better thing, well, I guess I'll do this.
Yeah. Okay. So what was one of your primary takeaways besides that of the Sam Harris and Peterson discussions that they've had that you've seen so far?
Well, I really liked night 2 when they started with the steel manning each other. You know, they tried to steel man each other again on day 3, and I didn't think that was as good. But when they started night 2 and it's like trying to explain each other's point of view to each other, I thought that was really, really good, and I like that. I think there is clearly value in story, or perhaps philosophy, because I cannot, or anyone for that matter, cannot independently generate all this stuff. It's nothing that I have the ability to do. And so it's something that we have derived. I mean, philosophy is literally shared wisdom, I believe, in terms of what it literally means. So it's our collective wisdom from various discoveries over time that we can learn from, so we don't have to reinvent it from scratch. So I like that value. I also like the fact that both sides are treating each other with respect and with attention, and not demonizing each other. So that's valuable. And I hope it gives a model for more of these discussions. I hope that there are more of these things in the future.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah. One of I think Sam Harris's short sights it is his description of well-being. It is quite vague and perhaps doesn't even describe the world as he might think it actually does, or no, not describing the world, but carries within it a meaning that is too vague to actually be productive and useful. So Harris holds a position that facts, our values are derived from facts, and including facts about subjective experiences, so pain and pleasure and well-being and peace and love, each of these things. And he holds that morality is just the description of well-being as had by individuals or even as groups, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point and fair criticism of Harris. I think trying to root your values in pure fact is a bit of a problem, because how would you say a fact makes something good or bad without a subjective impression? Seems an odd proposition. So I think Peterson's critique of Harris is correct on that. Now, the way to solve that problem from my point of view, and I'm not sure why Harris doesn't go down this road, he must have reasons, but the way to solve it for me is to say, well, we just have to make this observation that it seems all biological life that exists has this fundamental biological goal to improve its subjective utility, not with consideration to biological life as a whole, but with respect to its needs and wants. And some of these needs and wants and the ability to analyze that is extremely short term, because there's no mind at all that can be seen. So the simplest bacteria is doing things with a utility improvement in mind. It wants to avoid death and obtain resources to reproduce and spread and so forth. So there's good and bad from that point of view, from the bacteria's point of view of what will increase and decrease its utility. So it's like, well, for us as human beings, we can do this same sort of trick and say, well, for us, what is our subjective utility that that may not align with any particular species utility. And we eliminated the dodo bird presumably out of some sense of utility. It wasn't so much in the interest of the dodo bird or biological life as a whole, but nevertheless. So it's like all you need is this observation that there's this sort of inherent quality to life that is seeking to improve utility, and therefore utilitarianism is a grounded factual ethic that is observed from behavior. And it's like, well, that's where I would root it. I don't know why Harris doesn't go that way. Harris has long not been comfortable with the label of utilitarian. I mean, that's how I would phrase what he believes. He doesn't like that label for some reason, but okay, that's where I solve it.
Well, I think that's where there's kind of this smuggling in of this. Well, I guess okay. It seems to me that with that notion in mind, that there's this unconscious drive within all organisms, those with minds and without minds, towards some sort of utilitarian process, is it's very different from I guess, yeah, Sam Harris's position of deriving facts from deriving values from the facts, because for organisms that have no capacity to, well, okay, so yeah, organisms have the capacity to understand facts insofar as their sensory insofar as they can collect sensory data and turn that into their facts. Yeah, it seems like there's some sort of other process that's going on where humans, I'm just working off of humans since we understand them a little bit better, have this inherent value judging system where we have the capacity to judge what is of value and what is not of value, or like the higher quality of objects, or the better mate selections to like judging between potential mates, and beauty, like holding some sort of sense of beauty. These are all value observations, right, that certainly are composed of facts. So it is a fact that this painting in front of me is built with paints and canvas and in different colors, things like that. But besides that, there is the story aspect of how I look at this painting and different things like that. I think we talked about how a replication of a Monet painting that might be of even higher quality to a actual Monet painting will have lesser value because it doesn't have the story within it, the cultural story within it of a painter named Monet, who was this famous painter, actually drawing his brush upon it, instead of this schmuck that actually was just duplicating it.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I mean, you know, there's...
So I guess my point is humans tend to value the story element to objects much more so than the objective fact aspect of the object.
Yeah, most circumstances that's usually true. That the story has particular value beyond the pure object.
So is that?
But I think the story fills at least a plausible utilitarian function in that it feeds let's say our emotional parts of our brain, which is, you know, pure physical response too. So it's like, well, this object on a physical level is just like any other physical object, but there's an emotional element that's subjective or not. And, you know, just because society as a whole thinks it has value doesn't necessarily mean that I would have value in it. I mean, you know, maybe I'm not a fan of Monet. You know, maybe it would have no value to me beyond its utilitarian function, which is minimal. You know, a good example of this actually, I think, is gold, because, you know, some people who don't like fiat currency will say, well, you know, gold has an inherent value. Like, it really doesn't. You know, its utility value is actually really low. You know, it has some useful uses, no doubt. You know, and you can find useful purposes for it. But if that's all it was, I mean, it would be, yeah, $12 or something, you know.
That
The reason
it,
it's so expensive is because of this subjective value that, you know, has been sustained, but there's really nothing fundamentally to it.
the value within it is kind of its rarity. Because there's such a low quantity of this certain product, we place a higher amount of value to it. So like in regards to
That's
water.
true sometimes, but not all times. I mean, there's a lot of things that are rare that don't have particular value to anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's not just that. There's some other element within it that, like aesthetic value, I guess, within like rubies or gems or diamonds. Like diamonds have such a high value to them, even though they are not particularly expensive to create and are mostly overpriced for everything. But they carry sentimental value within themselves, which is like you can consider it irrational because it's a value that's placed on it because a value placed on it that does not have a grounding within the actual facts and reasons about these things.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some mysterious elements to this that are not completely quantifiable or completely understandable, and I think it might go to what I was saying earlier about maybe our inherent limitations. You know, our level of rationality is probably higher than any other species on Earth, but it's by no means clear that it's the highest level of rationality or highest level of awareness or highest level of consciousness or highest level of what other words you want to use in this place. That could be, you know, it's very well the proposition that on some sort of universal scale that we're not all that special after all. You know, we just have a frame of reference we're trying to work with. So yeah, the fact that there's some contradictions in this value and some illogical elements to it and some aspects that are mysterious and unclear, I don't find particularly troublesome. I take some comfort in the notion that to the degree that those are mysteries, there are fewer of them now than there have been at any other point in the past. And presumably will be fewer of them in the future.
I suppose my inherent fear for the more rationalistic approach to morality is in regards to our humans' capacity to create artificial intelligences that will be running off of this whatever form of morality we're programming into it. And so there's this moral nominalism or value nominalism, which is that values are valuable only insofar as we as a species has kind of pretended they are, or yeah. which is the fear from most like religious people, because the belief that these things don't have value in themselves points to the picture that if you specifically don't have this value in this thing, or no, it's the ability to, I guess, deny the value that other people have in this thing, I guess. Like Sam's inability to comprehend the Israel-Palestine conflict, that by his regards, these are just people arguing over a glass that Elton John didn't actually drink from. It's just a land composed of people's history. But
this is exactly what I'm talking. This is exactly what I'm talking about, though. If we were talking about any other thing, like diamonds or Elton John's glass, we could have a reasonable discussion about what value it should have. You know, and there are a lot of people, for diamonds, for example, are a good example. There are a lot of people who think diamonds shouldn't have any value. A lot of people who think that, you know, they're completely inflated and they're not important, and some people don't value them and don't exchange them for engagement you know? And the entire idea of diamonds as an engagement gift was essentially invented by the De Beers Company in the 1920s anyway.
Mhm.
So, you know, it's an artificial thing, but we could have that discussion. We could have that debate. You know, the fact that it doesn't have a inherent value beyond its commercial applicability doesn't really bother me. If, you know, diamonds became valueless except for the fact that they're the hardest substance on earth, and so we're going to put them on drills because they're robust. You know, its functional utility would be something, but, you know, beyond that, it's like the fact that it doesn't have any inherent value doesn't bother me. The thing that makes religion problematic is exactly the fact that when it comes to like the Israeli-Palestine conflict, the value is rooted in this supernatural entity from which there can be no debate or discussion. It's like, you know, the United States and Canada have a couple land disputes, nothing of, there's this like island off the coast of Maine that they both say they both own, you know? And it's like, okay, we can have a discussion about that and we can have a disagreement about it, but it's like, it's not rooted in this fundamental truism of, you know, it's given to us by God. It was given to us by God. It's like, it's not a dispute of that kind, you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, people are going to fight over it either way. Like, you could have these people saying it was given to us by God, or you can say this was something that was
given to us in the Treaty of whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the Treaty of Paris's, one of the many, many Treaty of Paris's. But don't quote me on that. But either way, it's like, yeah, but it's a different, it seems to me a different discussion of a different tenor. It's like, you know, it's not the same sort of vicissity where it's like, it's is inherently true and there can be no other way. I mean, even the Treaty of whatever that established it was an arbitrary agreement, right? There's no particular reason it had to be that way as opposed to something else. They picked a line on a map and, you know, okay, fine. But, you know, you could have a disagreement about where it should be, you know, so that's not in that same reverential space.
Sorry, one second. All right, I gotta leave pretty soon. But yeah. So the worry had by the religious it is the like God has a certain connotation within the minds of the more religious, especially like the Jews in this case, where it stands for their cultural history and their history of suffering, and also their history of spiritual experiences that has helped them deal with all of this suffering, and has the aspect of this unknown part of our own consciousness that has been collected into historical works of their people, or if they're fictional works of their people. Either way, these works are regarded as their most important book. And when the atheists come in and dismiss the idea of God existing as any sort of deity, it's seen as a dismissal of all of these properties that we've placed into this Elton John's glass, of everything that we've given up and suffered for and endured for this glass. To throw away this glass would be to throw away all of our history, and our ancestors' history, and all these things that they've sacrificed for.
No, I think that has a lot of sense to it, and you can see that in non-religious context. You know, the dispute between various familial groups or various countries that have non-religious contexts, where they go on and on because it doesn't become about the underlying dispute anymore. It becomes about the value to the lives lost, and the cyclical nature of it becomes a real continuing problem. So that's true. I think you make a very fair point, that the value is not only in the belief itself, but in the value of the things that are sacrificed for it. Now, from a purely logical point of view, I would argue that this is what's sometimes called the Concord fallacy. It's like, we've invested so much, we must keep going. The logical response to which is, sunk costs are sunk. We can't reclaim them. And just because we've gone so far, we must keep going. It's like, well, maybe we made the bad decision coming as far as we did, but at some point you just be like, well, that was dumb. Let's not keep going any further. Good money after bad is not a logical philosophy. But I do appreciate that you are pointing out that there is a lot of value that I'm asking people to give up. My argument is the value is inherently valueless, which is a difficult proposition if you're in their position.
Okay. How can you make that claim when a diamond itself is valueless, aside from its sentimental value, its utilitarian value, and its aesthetic value? These are all three values that are inherent within the belief in God and the religiosity of a people.
Yeah, well, with respect to the diamond, I can at least quibble with some of those values. Its utilitarian value I could quibble with because I've invented or found a substance that's better. Its emotional value I could quibble with because it's an artifice that doesn't really exist. And don't you understand that rubies are so much better? I mean, you could quibble with these values, and to some extent, you see that happen. The example that comes to mind immediately is the tulip crisis from the Dutch, where if you don't know the story, there was a period of time. I think this is the 1700s. You have to double check me on the facts on this, but there's a period of time where tulips were the thing in Holland, and the price became unbelievably inflated, and people were doing futures on these things and like chasing this thing, and it was a whole deal. And there came a point where the entire economy of Holland completely collapsed because it was all about tulips until some point it became unsustainable. So we've seen this happen in the past where these values in these things are established for a while and then they just disappear. So who can say if that will be true for diamonds or anything else? But at least you can have the discussion.
So yeah, but it seems to me the only way that you can have that discussion is when you're contrasting it in regards to some other value that the people hold. So the diamonds are not as useful as something that is prettier than a diamond, let's say. So aesthetic value is something important to these people. And so if they held diamonds as their most valuable rock, and then you showed them a rock that was more prettier than that, then yes, that makes sense in swapping over the value. And so, yeah, it's less.
So why can't you do that with God is the next point. It's like, why can't you say that all this value as such is an illusion, and here's something else that will be of a real value?
Because in order for the universe to make sense, there has to be some sort of value arbiter, at least within the religious mindset, that if the universe was created with no inherent value within it, or some sort of moral decreer of what is valuable and what isn't valuable, it's all up to, it's all relativistic, I suppose. So
well, maybe. I mean, a lot of the value in things has been clearly established by human beings. I mean, we've been talking about diamonds as an example of something that was established by human beings, and I don't think many people are bothered by the fact that it was something we constructed. So whether or not we constructed all values ourselves and there wasn't anything imposed on it is a reasonable proposition. And I'd also point out, as to the moral relativist point of view, or arguments like, okay, if there's no God, then all morals or all values become relativistic. Well, I was like, well, actually, strictly speaking, even if there is a God, it doesn't solve that problem, because now they're just defined by God as opposed to defined by us. But why is his view of what's valuable true, other than his power to punish people for not believing in it. You know, so it's the Euthyphro dilemma. For those of you who are familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma, it's like, are gods good because they're good, or because what the command is good? And it's like, well, you know, if you say that all values are coming from God, it's like, okay, why is that true? Is it true because it's inherent in some sense apart from God, or is it only true because God has decreed it? In the first example, where it's true independent of God, we don't need God because it's true independent of God. In the second example, where it's come from God, well, it's no less arbitrary. It's now just might makes right. It's truth through power. It's like, well, that's not really satisfying either. So it's like the fact that someone somewhere had to create it, I don't know why it's more valuable if God created it versus us. Can you explain that to me? Why, if God created it, it's more valuable than if we created it?
It seems like Peterson's point with maps of meaning is the ability to perceive value is built into us. And that's similar to the arguments made by many theists, where, like within Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, there's the idea of natural law, where people know what is better and worse for them. And so for them to act in accordance to what they know to be worse for them is essentially known as a sin within their own minds or within the minds of the people around them. Like if the person is sinning unknowingly, the people around them recognize this is something that is negative for them in regards to their future. So like being addicted to heroin, that is absolutely a positive experience for the person themselves, but it requires kind of an external circle of people that hold this person to be more valuable alive than dead or poor and addicted to heroin. It's not a individually derived basis, but a communally derived basis. But I do have to head off to work. I'm not sure. I noticed, Tyler, you've joined.
Hello, John.
If you re-sign on, let's see, under this account, you should have the capacity to stop the broadcast, but I have to go. Or I guess you could restart, since I'm sure you wanted to get a hold of Kurt and I guess carry on my discussion with him.
Yeah, I think there were a few things that we could talk about for sure. I don't know if we necessarily have to continue the broadcast or record it.
Okay.
Well, it doesn't matter. Whatever you want to do.
Well, yeah, I have to leave, so I'll leave it up to you guys, but I will stop the broadcast now. So thank you all for watching or listening to this later on. If you'd like to participate in any of our discussions that we have during the weekends, go to jordanbpeterson.community. There's a calendar link that has the links to our discussions on Friday nights and Saturday mornings. And then, yeah, so thank you all.